Welcome back. We are now going to begin our second panel on literature, fiction, and storytelling. When we put together the vision for this conference on art, the sacred, and the common good, I think it's pretty clear how the choral music that we just heard performed relates to the sacred. But we also heard in our morning panel that really anything humans create can open up the door to the transcendentals. So the big vision for this panel, for me speaking as a sociologist who has drifted into moral philosophy and now into practical theology, I think one idea that really transformed me as I began to read more moral philosophy was that as human beings, we're fundamentally storytellers. We all tell stories about our lives, and our identities are caught up in shared stories, common stories. So one of the goals of this panel was to bring together professional storytellers from different genres of fiction, poetry, James Matthew Wilson, who is a poet and a philosopher. He's also the director of the new Catholic Masters of Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. We also have Chris Beha, a graduate of Princeton University and a novelist. He is also the editor of Harper's magazine. And we have Caleb Brown. He is a screenwriter and a script doctor is another way of saying it. Yes, so he works in the medium of image, film, video. So you each come from a different kind of genre. I will also say, because I've had extensive conversations with each of you, that the work you do professionally is also something I believe you reflected about personally. How do you educate your own children in story and reading and the love of the art form that you have? How do you pass on your work? And honestly, each of you wouldn't have taken time away from your families and your careers if you weren't committed to passing on a bigger vision of how being a writer is not just something you do for your paycheck or for your self-expression, although maybe those things are important, but because you believe somehow what you do contributes to the common good. So I wanted to start off our conversation really just asking a kind of basic question and seeing how each of you might answer. What does literature, fiction, poetry, film writing as an art form have to do with the sacred and with our shared identities? So that's kind of a big overarching question to this. And I thought maybe we could just take a moment and have each of you let the audiences know a little bit about some of your work and how you see the work that you're doing contributing somehow to restoring a sense of the sacred, building a shared identity, and addressing some of the deep concerns and problems that we were talking about in the earlier panel about whether or not people are even ready to be able to enter into beauty. So maybe I will start on the end of the row. Maybe I'll start with James.
This is on. Up to my mic. Okay, I can do that, I think. Can you just repeat the last part of that question? Because I was worried about the mic.
Well, sort of a general orienting question to this panel is, what does fiction have to do with the sacred? And how is there a work of yours, a piece of fiction, that you think exemplifies for our listeners what literature or fiction has to do with the sacred and the common good?
So I'm hoping to maybe return to an aspect of this question later in our discussion and to reflect a little bit on some of what we heard this morning in the first panel. But to begin with just my own experience, I started writing early and started writing fiction and went to study in the Hopwood program at the University of Michigan, intending to be a novelist, and had written a great number of short stories and was finishing my first novel when I was a runner-up for the Frederick Exley fiction contest at GQ magazine, which a friend of mine had placed in the year before and had gotten a 3-book deal out of it. So I thought, I'm on the cusp of becoming a novelist. And it wasn't losing the Exley that cursed me. It was rather hearing a professor try to explain how iambic pentameter worked. As he spoke of blank verse and the pentameter line, I sat there thinking, how do you do this? How do you count syllables in such a way as to make them form a line of verse? And I don't remember the rest of the day's lesson because I sat there trying to write this line, a sonnet every day for 5 long years. And it took the rest of the class just to write that line. I went home that night and wrote 13 more lines over the course of 5 hours, and when I was done, I had a sonnet. And went running down the halls of the dorm room to show it to all my friends. Look what I've done. It was truly an epiphany of making. This seemed to be the greatest thing I had ever done. And I had worked in construction and built things in high school, so I was used to making things. But this seemed like a miracle of making. There was that I entered into a kind of mystery. I came home from class for the next 4 nights, and every night spent 5 hours writing another sonnet, which ended up being about a guy who lives on the Jersey Shore drinking himself to death because he's upset about the election of Ronald Reagan. Who knows where that came from? I was, from my earliest youth, a great, passionate admirer of Ronald Reagan, so I just don't know where that came from. But what that encounter with the mystery of putting words in order said to me is that the act of human making is not creative. It's a kind of ontological discovery. It's the act of making involves the practice of any craft involves a kind of conformity of the will to nature to bring something into being that wasn't there, but can only come to be through the cooperation of laws that you don't know yet, and that it's the act of making that teaches you the laws that you're obeying. Why this matters is in the terms of my own biography anyhow, is that I had a wonderful group of fiction writers with whom we critiqued each other's stories in my apartment one night a week. And we didn't have a whole lot in common except for 2 convictions. One was that craft mattered, and it mattered for the reasons I just suggested. And that craft well done could transform your life. That art, as the great sonnet of Rilke, the archaic torso of Apollo ends, you must change your life. To encounter a well-made thing of beauty throws down a gauntlet to the human soul to perceive the world more accurately and to live differently in consequence. I don't want to put too much of an emphasis on the live differently in consequence because what that encounter is not primarily moral. It's primarily ontological. That is to say, it's an encounter with reality, which is why, and an encounter with being can lead us in all kinds of directions. You know, Terry Eagleton once said that the people who were great advocates of the moral uplift of literature, when they went into Auschwitz and found the guards had been reading Goethe, they suddenly had some explaining to do. And I think that's true. And the explanation is that evil is part of an encounter with being, and so the encounter with works of art is not doesn't have a clearly defined moral valence. It's a more profound mystery than that. Encountering merely at this humanistic level, this level of the act of making, the way in which the made thing suddenly places demands upon us made me see slowly that the great humanistic aspiration is just to do a good job, to make something good, open inevitably onto the more profound mystery of the origin of things. Which is why, on the one hand, I'm a great believer in craft as its own end. that the artist's task is to just make a good work, but that there's a kind of irreducible tethering of that act of making to the life of the spirit and the transformation of the soul to become adequate to being and being itself.
Thank you, first of all, for having me here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to just keep my remarks pretty brief so we can get into the conversation. I just want to raise a kind of trope that I fall back on when I think about some of the issues that you brought up in the introduction. It's said that when Constantine was building his eastern capital, he removed the temple statues from the temples throughout the empire, and he used them as decorative art throughout the streets of Constantinople. And the speculation is that he was doing this for two reasons. One, he was in the process of semi-passively Christianizing the empire, obviously, and so to remove the statues from the temple was to remove their ritualistic power in a certain way. To also open up the temples, many of which were converted into Christian churches. But there was another important element, which was by putting them out in the streets, he was allowing them to serve a kind of decorative function. And this was a central part of the process of removing their ritualistic power. And it also meant that during this transition to the Christian era, people who felt uncomfortable with losing their connection to the powers of the old ways could feel in some sense that the old ways were there, even though, of course, their power had been removed from them. And it is my sense that almost every form of art has gone through at some point in its history a kind of process like this of being removed from the temple and being made into something decorative. We know the way that it's happened with music, during this wonderful performance that we just all enjoyed. We had to be reminded this is not a concert. It's a prayer, because we have become so used to, even when we're hearing liturgical music, to think about it in terms of a kind of a concert, an entertainment. And we know about liturgical painting, devotional painting. We know about what's happened with poetry and some of its roots in liturgy. We know about the theater, the part that Greek tragedy played in ritual, but then also, the Elizabethan theater had its roots in mystery plays and passion plays. There is, as far as I know, the first exception to that rule is the novel. And we've had some disagreements over this, but the novel is a fundamentally secular art. The novel started outside of the temple. The novel was never brought out of the temple into the streets. What does that mean? That means the novel has always been charged with creating its own context. This is one of the reasons why early novels are quite... one of the most urgent projects of any early novelist was to explain what this book was you held in your hand, what it was doing, how it came to be, and why you were reading it. So in a novel like Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, he's constantly, there's an authorial voice explaining to you, this is this new thing called a novel. The other strategy for dealing with this problem was to pretend it was something other than a novel. So we know that a great many early novels were epistolary. We know that they had forms of found documents like journals. Defoe actually did not put his own name on the title page of Robinson Crusoe, and there was almost in a James Fry way, a suggestion that you were actually reading the journals of a real castaway. And so that has been, we have now become habituated to the idea of reading a novel as an entertainment, and so we don't always have a voice in our heads saying, well, who is this speaking? Who is this narrator? Why am I reading this prose work that's a story about made-up people? In the high points of 19th century realism, the novel, as a let's call it an unproblematic art form, arose and almost immediately began to be undermined by the modernists. It's obviously a key strategy of the modernists to try and attach pre-novelistic epic forms to the novel. That's why you have novels like Ulysses. That's why you have Thomas Mann's novels like Dr. Faustus and The Magic Mountain. So the question of what is this form, what is it doing, what is its context, is built into the novel because it did not begin within a spiritual or liturgical or sacred context and then get removed from it. So that is a challenge for any novelist who is interested in creating art that can participate in the sacred or play this role. But it's also a great benefit to the novelist precisely because so many of the other forms have lost that context and they do not have a good means of creating the context themselves. So you have to explain to people before you start, this isn't a concert. You know, you're used to, when you're listening to music, listening to it in this way. We're going to do it in the old way, you know? There was no old way for the novel, and so that's something, as a novelist, you're constantly doing, is creating the context for your own work. When I think about these issues, that's kind of the way that I am thinking about them. I think about them in the context of someone who is engaged in the secular art of novel writing, and how you create space for the sacred within that secular art. That's maybe a starting point, and we can get into more of it as we go along.
So my ambition when I moved to Los Angeles was in fact to find out how you could make movies that create an occasion in which someone can have contact with the Holy Spirit. That was my lofty ambition, but I had layers and layers of naivety around that. So Mel Gibson had just put out The Passion. It was that kind of occasion of of making something so familiar, fresh and visceral, and it's now it's time for Christians to go take over Hollywood. I also made buckets and buckets of money. This is going to be great. I'm going to serve Jesus, and I'm going to get rich. I'm a millennial. So I went out there, and you soon discover that the only people sitting in rooms kind of talking clandestinely about taking over Hollywood are Christians. And we're complaining about the Philistine tastes of this town. All they care about is sex and drugs and fame, and we're trying to tell real stories of religious impact, and they're not going to give it to us because they're evil. I had a revelation through a USC professor who was teaching at Act One at the time. Her name was Babette Buster, and she had spent 8 hours breaking down the Shawshank Redemption, another movie that meant a lot to me. She went sort of beat by beat, pausing it and asking, what are we feeling and why are we feeling it? And showing all the layers of a film, kind of like someone would study a novel in an English class, but this was a film. And the theme of hope in Shawshank Redemption is not just some it's not something that shows up in anybody's, actually it does show up a lot, on the nose. But it's also earned, and it imparts a feeling of hope, an experience of that theological virtue that you can take with you as equipment for living. And that struck me as maybe God has been active in Hollywood long before Christians tried to come in and take it over. Maybe there is a logos to the universe behind the world that we share that can't help but pop out of movies that are made by whoever's making them. So I was struck by this experience of someone peeling back the layers and being kind of a museum guide, or more like what do you call it, a sommelier, who's pointing out these different taste notes and like through this experience of watching something so that you get more out of it than you could have ever done on your own. And so, yeah, my ambition is still to like write things that put people in contact with like genuine experiences of faith, hope, and love. I guess that's the answer.
Well, thank you. I think I want to give you each an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into one of the central questions that I think each of you talked a little bit about. What does it mean for your literary genre or for fiction in general to have a public role? So I earlier talked about the sacred, but I think in part of thinking through what does literature fiction have to do with kind of a public identity and what's the relationship to the sacred, we can pull out a little bit more about what each of you thinks about how your work shapes. I mean, I guess I would just be curious. I'm more of a consumer of literature than a writer. If I write anything, it's more creative, nonfiction, so autobiographical, but true stories, and I try to use the tools of fiction, right? So I read a book by Solstein, right, that he says that people who do history and sociology, the field I was trained in, we take all the drama out of life and treat people like data, points of data. So actually, I was pretty interested, Chris, that you wrote an entire book about what happens when we create a world where people are treated as data. So maybe actually I would just ask you to comment on that novel, right? The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. Because you said a moment ago that the novel is a secular form of art. So granted that, I really see in your work a deep understanding of the human person, a critique of a kind of reductionist mentality that we heard about this morning. And I wonder then, in writing a novel like that, what is your motivation and what do you hope that readers are going to question, or where are you hoping to lead them by going into a novel the way that you did it with the Index of Self-Destructive Acts?
So the honest answer is I don't think a ton about the reader while I'm working. I mean, that's just, which obviously ultimately, you know, what you want to have an impact on a reader. But Don DeLillo said that writing is a concentrated form of thinking, and that is a lot of it for me. I also find writing itself to be a kind of devotional practice. It is a kind of deep attention. At a certain stage so for me, I'm writing to try and sort things out for myself. At a certain stage in the process, having created this work whose origin was a working out for oneself, two things happen. One, the dictates of craft come in, and you want it to be a well-made work. You don't want it simply to be a working through for yourself, but you want it to be, in some way, an objective correlative of that working out. You know, and then the other thing is you do start to think about readers and making this thing explicable to them. But I think, for me at least, I could not start with a message I have for the reader. And then as though it were a kind of an essay or a term paper or something like that. What I can say is that we have gotten into, I think, in the present cultural moment, an unfortunate divide where there are people who want to read literature and art in general in a very narrowly political way. They want to discern what the political message is, and then they want to check the political hygiene of that message, and then they judge the work on the basis of that. And that's, I think, that's a mistake. That's a kind of dead end to me, and I think there's a lot of just bad art that I find philosophically and spiritually impeccable, and politically impeccable, and is still bad art. And there is also, I think, some great art that is deeply questionable on those fronts. But the response, I think, has been this running away from the idea that the moral implications of your work is a significant factor in judging the work, right? So the response to the politicizing of work has been, on the other hand, people saying, basically treating all art as a form of escapist entertainment, and that we make a mistake when we try and ask those kinds of serious questions about art. So I think what we probably share in common is a sense of the aesthetic as an autonomous realm of knowledge about the world, right? And there are certain kinds of truths that can only be arrived at aesthetically, and so that, to the extent that there is to me, a kind of a public mission to my work in the way you're talking about, I suppose it would be that. I want to assert the fact, and this is why when I say when I say that the novel is a secular art form and it has its own context, I don't mean to say that as a novelist I'm not concerned with the issues you're raising. I'm obsessed with them in a lot of ways. But the particular thing that happens when you approach those through a work of art that is an autonomous work of art, that is a big part of what interests me. And I want readers to have that aesthetic experience, and I also want them to understand that aesthetic experience as putting them in touch with something, with some underlying reality.
That was brilliant, Chris. I want to turn that question over to Caleb and also to James, maybe rephrase if I think I heard what you were saying in resonance with what the other's saying. I hear you describing writing of a novel, again, to use the word that James used and you just used it, as a craft. And in that craft, there's a process of discovery, even for yourself. So you don't start out with a meaning you're trying to convey to other people, because you yourself as a writer are trying to discover for yourself what this story is about. But then I think the next step, and maybe you could answer this as well as the others, as a master of a craft, you reflect on what you've created. And you ask yourself, oh, is it conveying what I think it's supposed to be conveying? So there is that moment in the writing when you ask, is this craft actually conveying something? And that would be part of what distinguishes a good piece of craft from a craft that never really gets to be a craft, that it is communicating something. But you don't always start out with that knowledge, is what I heard you say.
Yeah, it is certainly one thing to set out to tell resonant stories of faith, hope, and love, and another thing entirely to actually do it. It's so hard. And my initial naive idea is okay, how am I going to cooperate with the Holy Spirit in crafting something that's going to speak to people? And it was sort of it was almost like automatic writing and a quietism. It's I will put my hands on the keyboard and God will dictate to me like he did to the authors of the Bible, right? Well, this was extremely futile. And as a screenwriter, I was hidebound not to have a job. So here I am, sitting, not writing, not having a job, and trying to serve God this way. And so thankfully, this turned my attention to well, how did God speak to the writers of the Bible? And as you discover, the idea that God communicates directly to you onto the page, Joseph Smith has that idea. Muhammad has that idea. The Christian Bible, not at all. It's so many different people at so many different times, and all these different redaction phases, and who even knows if they bound it all together, and why it's a messy story. And so how could I expect to write something without having an extremely messy process, and in film, an extremely messy process with a lot of voices involved. So, yeah, the only kind of anchor that I've latched onto is that if you're trying to tell a story about faith, hope, and love, you have to say something about faith, hope, or love, what's causing it or frustrating it in the world. So if we use Shawshank Redemption as an example, say that movie's about hope that makes you feel very nice and it reminds you that the movie is about something that made you feel good. But what is it saying about hope? And how is that being communicated visually and through the soundtrack and through the writing and the performances? Spoilers, Shawshank Redemption is about hope creating, that hope creates freedom. And it's not like a kind of precious moments idea of hope. It is a kind of gritty St. Paul idea of hope, that there's this distant future thing that I can put my hope in, and I will take all the necessary steps over 20 years digging through a wall in a prison to get there. And and you communicate this journey through two different characters that occupy different sides of this idea. This theme of like hope creates freedom is sort of meaningless and banal without its shadow side, which is like what hope is to Red, Morgan Freeman's character. Hope will make you sick. Hope is not going to help you survive. You need to adapt. You need to live within the confines of the world that you've been provided. Contrast that with Andy Dufresne putting on opera against the warden's rules to give someone a sense that there is a life beyond these walls, this isn't all there is. I could spend 8 hours, like Babette Buster did, unpacking all the many ways this simple idea of hope creating freedom is borne out visually and in the sound design. But I'll have to sell a ticket to that class.
Let's pass it to James, because you also mentioned your work as a craft, but I see sitting next to you, a craft where you're discovering the meaning, but I see you have sitting next to you one of your poems, The River of the Immaculate Conception, which I always thought you conceived a particular idea in your head when you wrote that. So just how do you think about craft as well as the public role of poetry in creating a shared meaning?
Great. So as I usually do, I'm going to fall back on the life story of T.S. Eliot, because I think he was one of those essential people of the 20th century in the sense that the questions that he was grappling with internally seemed to be the great questions of the period in which he lived. He's fortunate to have had his personal drama be such a public drama in that respect. So just going back to Chris's comments earlier, I'm reminded of Eliot's early essay, Ulysses, Order and Myth, which was his first bit of writing on Joyce and the aspirations of Ulysses, which you mentioned earlier, Chris. And Eliot says something that resonated with me deeply and painfully on initial contact, and that he says, perhaps what Joyce has helped us discover is that the novel was never a form. It was the expression of a certain class, which is a bit like the Anglican Church. But I mean, that's he doesn't say that part. It's just, but yeah, you could feel it in the background because this is right after his conversion. But and I think what he's able to sort of safely say there that I don't think Joyce would have wanted to say was, as a poet, he's standing outside of the essential concerns of the novelist, and he's able to sort of dismiss it in that way. But that dismissing is too strong a word, but something like a disenchantment occurred to me with fiction, as I mentioned earlier, with the first encounter with verse, and I think it was that with the writing of verse, the form made is so irreducibly in front of you at all times that it truly becomes, in every genre of poetry, and I want to come back to the idea, in every genre of poetry, it becomes a matter of seeing the form. Fiction is a matter of seeing the form. Fiction is the making of plots to see the form of a life or the form of an action. But it's not, and it's a very profound way of seeing the form, because it's how we determine what virtue and vice look like, what good and evil look like. But again, that's not the furthest depth of human life. Our knowledge goes beyond our own actions. It goes beyond what Vico would have called facts. It goes beyond what we can do and make for ourselves, and it goes into the deep recesses of being. And so Eliot, I think, was sort of carving out a position for the poet as the one who represents the form of reality, whereas the novelist, in a sense, might be a sociologist or something like that, who's representing only a certain surface. Something like that happens in the classical tradition too, incidentally. I mean, everybody exalts Aristotle's great Poetics, which really is one of the great works of literary criticism of all time, but as the first work of literary criticism, and as a defender of poetry and the arts, as opposed to Plato's reputed expulsion of the poets from the city. But in fact, Plato has a much more profound attachment to poetry than does Aristotle. Aristotle appreciates poetry as kind of philosophical, can tell you something about good and evil, virtue and vice, and so on and so forth. Plato says, hold my beer, Aristotle. The true poet can tell you what the soul is and where it fits in the cosmos, which is what he does in the Phaedrus. And in other words, the true poet can tell you things that aren't even in this world. They're what form the fundamental structure of the world and govern it. Eliot, I think, discovered that late in his life when he wrote Four Quartets, which is the great Christian Platonist poem and the great poem of the 20th century. But before he did that, he quit writing poetry because the lyric seemed not public enough. It was too private. It was people reading The Wasteland in a coffee shop somewhere with a beret, and not a socially formative, civilizing kind of art form. And so I think that rendered him deeply insecure. And so in the late 20s, in the early 30s, Eliot begins speaking about how he should like to write plays. And what you hear there, and he's quite direct about it actually, is that he wants to play a public role, but as a poet, he doesn't think he can unless he begins writing verse plays. And so though many of his plays are quite wonderful, in a sense, he was willing to write inferior art for the sake of having a public role. And had he not then composed Four Quartets, I would have thought this a grave mistake and really, an errancy on his part led by his own misunderstanding of the art form. Where did he go wrong? I think in not realizing that all poems and all works of art are fundamentally about seeing the form, and that lyric poetry has a deeply liturgical function. It's about seeing the structure of first language, of thought, and then of being together. And so in that way, it actually does something analogous to what occurs in the Mass, where liturgical form is a reporting back to us of the order that God has revealed to us. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a poem about the nature of the Mass. It's the last poem in the River of the Immaculate Conception. Hasten to aid thy fallen people. So this is the end of the Mass. But how does one make a song of holiness, or speak of music without spoiling it? They both seem more than our tongues can confess, and born above in our world do not fit. What's more, those who ascend with them are closed in on themselves, struck dumb, and all in ecstasy that they have heard seems flailing, foolish in a fallen word. But every rising strain must strain indeed to lend a form to what in truth is light, and manifest peace as if it's a deed, and give transcendence some arc of a flight. The purity of every saint will be daubed on with sloppy paint, and what no thought may comprehend or say must be taught in the staging of a play. The gift of form, because so fascinating as we bend down to work with knife or ruler, reminds us that beyond it's always waiting some piercing light. Consider how the jeweler makes every cut upon a stone for its sake, but not that alone. His patient labor wasted if a line does not refract and multiply and shine. And any humble implement may serve to figure forth and yet conceal that light, so that high thought is felt upon each nerve and mystery is given to our sight. Just this way, things are lifted up, a chalice wrought from wooden cup, a little dust and water mixed to clay and molded into birds that fly away. The Mass is first his earthen sacrifice, but also taste of peace and heaven's throne, the gift that leaves behind all thought of price, yet where no less we raise a plangent groan, for at its finish we are sent into the world both dark and bent, that bearing out the Virgin's hastening aid, from ruined choirs some good may be remade.
Thank you.
Can I just jump right in? I agree with Eliot that the novel is not a form. And I think you could say it's a genre, but that novels have with each other, what Wittgenstein would call family resemblances. There isn't a set of defining characteristics that you could say that every novel has, and then indeed it is the novelist's, one of the novelist's primary jobs to figure out what form that particular novel is supposed to take. There's a handful of novelists, including probably the greatest one, Tolstoy, who were aggressively unconcerned with form. Tolstoy wanted his novels to feel like life. He didn't want them to feel like art, and he felt like it did not do justice to life to try and fit it into a form. And yet, obviously, Tolstoy had a deeply metaphysical understanding of human truth and reality, but he still even in his later days was never a formalist. And then you have a novelist like Nabokov, who was greatly influenced by Tolstoy and greatly concerned with those the telling details of human reality that make something feel lived, and yet was himself a formalist and also considered art to be a kind of fairy tale. And he thought that the job of the artist was to make you feel a kind of shiver in the base of your neck. It was supposed to be somewhere between your head and your heart, essentially. But any novelist that actually had anything to say to you was making a kind of category error. And Nabokov hated Thomas Mann, and he hated Dostoevsky, and he hated Faulkner, and he hated any novelist that thought of himself as a bit of a philosopher. And particularly in all of those cases, obviously, any novelist who was a little slack in his prose because he was actually trying to get at the truth, and the truth didn't always fit into neat prose. And I will say, I'm among those people. I don't trust any novelist who didn't go through an obsessive Nabokov stage. And I also don't trust any novelist who is still in that stage. And I am one of those writers who in college became obsessed with Nabokov and such that I decided that I didn't like Thomas Mann or Dostoevsky either. And he's obviously, Nabokov is reading Dostoevsky in Russian and is in a great position to judge him as a Russian prose stylist, which I am not. But still, I was able as a 25-year-old to tell people that Dostoevsky is not a great novelist. And it's funny because Dostoevsky actually has these, he's thought of as a young person's novelist. He has these existential themes. He has these highly emotionally charged incidents. And these characters who are deeply concerned with living authentic lives. And so people actually think of Dostoevsky as one of those people who a certain kind of young reader becomes obsessed with, and they kind of grow out of their Dostoevsky stage into being more of a Tolstoyan. But I have become much more of a Dostoevskian as I've gotten older. You obviously are not advocating a kind of empty formalism. There is your sense of formalism, as I understand it, is deeply related to a belief that reality itself has a form, because reality itself is a created thing. And that is one of the central, I think, issues that a novelist who has to create a form and decide what that form is has to face up to, is the question: is form something that human intelligence imposes on reality, or is form something that exists in reality because reality is a created thing and that we can discover? Beckett's line about this was that the writer's job was to find a form to accommodate the mess. And I think there are a lot of writers who do think that reality is essentially a mess, and that to the extent that our work has form, it's a form that we impose on it. The more formally perfect a work is, the less it actually has to do with life. And that is that's the direction that I think Nabokov takes us in. And then the alternate view is, of course, that we live in a created order. And it was not created by us. And so if we want our work to represent reality, it has to have these formal elements to it. But then I think you have to look very, very carefully at reality and try and see, or the piece of reality that you're trying to get at, and try to understand what form it takes. And it's not always a pre-existing form. And so I think the freedom that the novelist has in that area can be, again, a great opportunity.
Well, that exchange between you two leads me, I think, to a question that I get a lot when I'm talking about beauty and storytelling. A lot of young people ask me whether or not novels, poetry, films need to display somehow the complexity of human life, including its darkness, right? So what I heard in this exchange, and going back to our earlier panel, it's like, well, it's really hard to describe human experience without a keen attention to all of its complexity, including its darkness, which sometimes I think leads people to an obsession perhaps with the grotesque or the dark or the scary. But the title of my forthcoming book, The Wounds of Beauty, I took from an essay by Pope Benedict, in which he says that part of what kind of Christian hope allows us to do is to see the complexity of life, including the darkness, but still with a lens of hope. But, and I had to read the essay a few times to get this, he also says that when experienced, beauty itself wounds us, because it opens up our desires. It deepens our thirst for the good and the true and the beautiful. So according to that understanding, the beautiful music we just participated wounded us because it deepened our desire for the sacred. So how would you respond to the young people that I hear all the time who are looking for a way to encounter some of the darkness of human life and its complexity? But is it important to also do that in a way that is wounding people in the way Benedict talks about, deepening their desires for the true and the good and the beautiful?
Sure. There's a risk in this advice, but I think let's take a series like Breaking Bad. Is Breaking Bad just like everything that's wrong with our culture, that we want to watch someone do all these things, and like that we empathize with this man, which by the way is an achievement of the writers, that they do get you to empathize with him. But people can watch that like they watch Fight Club, and like teenage boys are like, Walter White, what a badass, like I want to be like this guy. And that's in there. That's in there on purpose. You need to feel like you're rooting for him, and you're a little bit proud of him at times, and you're a little bit shocked that you are, because you don't, like he's doing awful things. But you have to be an educated reader of these, of such material, or it can backfire on you. Like Breaking Bad is a portrait of like a very focused pursuit of self-respect from someone who felt like they were missing out on it. And in the last few years of their life, they decide, I'm gonna die. I better get some respect for myself. And he does it through making drugs and making a lot of money. What would make somebody do that? He is but don't we also have like a kind of a notion in our culture that you ought to like, go for it, be yourself, live your best life. Like don't let anybody get in your way. The single-mindedness with which Walter White pursues this desire to respect his self is a portrait of pride that haunts me. It's a portrait of pride that at times reminds me, like, oh, that's a little bit like my incredible interest in like being the best in this scenario is I ought not to trust that. So in some ways, exposure to darkness, to vice, to evil things is, with the proper dosage and the right age of person, can act like an inoculation, can act like a vaccine against recognizing it and therefore rejecting it.
So I keep coming back very specifically to the history of the novel as a form, and you guys may have gathered that it is of interest to me. But this is a criticism that has been made against the novel for as long as the novel has existed. That it ought to show exemplary figures, that it ought to be engaged in moral uplift. The first and still among the great realist novels ever written was, of course, Don Quixote, and this is, its subject is in many ways disenchantment, but the idea of that the romantic literature that preceded it, the form of the romance, was essentially false, and that a false picture is what's dangerous, because it gets you causing damage out in the world because you think that the picture it's giving you is true. That is part of the message of Don Quixote. That is the message in certain respects of Madame Bovary, because Emma Bovary reads romance novels that makes her feel that to have an affair is going to give a certain kind of meaning to her life, and there's going to be a kind of experience that comes out of it. That is the message in a very similar way to Anna Karenina. And I think Tessa the D'Urbervilles, many novels take up this subject of basically the harm that is caused from reading books that aren't true. And generally they are untrue in a particular way, which is that they show you in too gritty detail the darker sides of life, but that they try and exclude the darker sides of life from the picture. For those of us in the room who are Catholics, it is obviously part of what we believe, that we are fallen, and that any picture that of reality that excludes the darkness is a false picture, and not just a false picture, but a dangerously false picture, because it gives you a sense of human sufficiency. And it gives you a sense that we do not need the grace of God. And so I'm much more concerned with the risk of not showing a sufficiently dark picture, to be honest, than with the risk of only showing exemplary characters.
In my second book of poems, The Hanging God, I read a fair amount of narrative poems, and in that book in particular, the book as a whole is anchored by two poetic sequences. One called Wiped Out is a series of Spenserian sonnets about a man who falls in love with a stripper who then proceeds to bring him down into the depths even farther than the degradation of being with her, and he is left alone with his hunger for this woman who's become utterly empty to him. And then the other sequence is the Stations of the Cross, and about Christ's passion on the cross. You might think, actually, to read the modern Catholic novelists, that they have nothing to write about except for sinners. Francois Mauriac and Bernanos, and Graham Greene, they're consumed by these characters who are, I think Mauriac puts it, they're sinners rather than religionless. They're people who know that they're vile, rather than thinking that, as Hobbes might have put it, that we're fallen, but it's not our fault. This is just how things always were. But I just don't think the terms of these arguments have changed too much in 2,500 years. The first thing Aristotle tells us is that we like imitation. And then the first example he gives us is, for example, we really like looking at imitations of dead bodies. I think he had a good reason for bringing that up. All of our art is about dead bodies, or most of it. There are far more examples for writing tragedy, degradation, and evil in the history of our literary tradition. Far more examples than of beatitude. Really, for beatitude, we have one poem, Dante's Paradise. That doesn't mean we shouldn't write about it, but it's our oldest art is an art of wounding by violence. And that's beauty. It is beautiful. It's not just imitation. We haven't solved the problem of art and beauty when we say, well, we'll just follow Aristotle and talk primarily the language of mimesis rather than the language of kalan, of beauty, to kalan. Rather, we need to, as David's comments this morning indicated, we need to have a more adequate definition of beauty. And you could read my book, The Vision of the Soul, or I could just give you the answer now. The only definition of beauty I think that possibly works, especially if beauty really is a property of being, is beauty is existent form's capacity to disclose itself. In other words, it's being's self-gift to other being. Being gives itself away to the mind as true. It gives itself away to the will as good. But being's not exhausted by truth and goodness. There's something more fundamental, like a light shining out in the very existence of things, and that's beauty. And the thing is, as somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins, with his obsessed with pied beauty, might have given it to us, most of our encounters of really seeing form, of really seeing being, come when we're shocked by that which is grotesque, that which stands apart from the ordinary. Just because it's, in one sense, very ugly doesn't mean it's also not beautiful.
Thank you. Well, we could have kept this conversation going all day, and in fact, maybe at some point in the future, Scala will have an all-day conference just about literature, but that wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to have a conversation this afternoon about sacred art and sacred music. So I am going to give you a 2-hour lunch break. We could keep you inside of the beige walls of this campus for lunch, but we didn't want to deprive you of the beauty of Princeton. So you are free to find yourself a lunch. We do have tables set up outside for you if you want to get carry out and bring it back. We will be percolating some coffee for you. And if you don't know someone, you're here by yourself, please invite someone else to lunch. We hope that you get these 2 hours are for you to have a break and to enjoy each other's company, get some lunch, enjoy the beautiful day. See you back here at 2:30, and thank you so much to our panelists.